Last week we studied Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar, let's see if I can get that right. Neb, how's that? Neb had a dream, and the dream troubled him. It troubled him so much that he called for the magicians, the sorcerers, the astrologers, and the Chaldeans. And he called them into his chamber, and he told them that he wanted them to interpret the dream. But not just to interpret the dream, he wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed because he forgot what he had dreamed. Or at least that's what the King James Version seems to imply. Look at verse number 5. In verse number 5 it says, the dream was gone from him. In other words, he couldn't remember it. So he demanded that they not only interpret his dream, but they also revealed to him what he had dreamed. Now, I don't know if he really forgot what he had dreamed or if he was just testing them to see if they could really interpret the dream. But one thing is for sure. He wanted them to tell him what the dream was and to interpret the dream. And if they couldn't do it, he was going to execute them. And guess what? They said, this is impossible. No one can do this. So Nebuchadnezzar said, all right, then all the astrologers, all the sorcerers, all the magicians, all the Chaldeans are going to be put to death. Now, what's interesting is that Daniel wasn't with them, even though he belonged to the group known as the Chaldeans. So when they came to get Daniel, and not just Daniel, they came to get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to execute them. Daniel told the person who came to get them, hey, go tell the king that if he'll give me just a little bit of time, I'll be able to tell him what he had dreamed, and I'll be able to tell him the interpretation of the dream. So they did. They gave him a little bit of time to pray and to seek God's face. And of course, what did God do? He honored that because Daniel was a man of God. And he gave unto him a vision of what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed. And God also revealed the interpretation of the dream. So when Daniel went to the king, he revealed the dream. And in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a huge statue of a man. The head of the statue was made of gold. The chest and arms were of silver. The belly and thighs were bronze. The legs were iron, and the feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. And as Nebuchadnezzar was looking at the statue, a rock was cut from a mountain, and it struck the feet, and it bashed it or smashed it into pieces, and the statue just kind of crumbled and fell into all these different pieces. And then this great wind came, and it blew it all away until there was nothing left. Then the rock became a great mountain, and it spread over the entire earth. Now, that's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and this is a picture of what he saw in the dream. Now, the reason we think this is what he saw is because Clarence Larkin did a lot of study, and he went back to the type of statues they made in this period, and this is probably what it looked like. We don't know for sure, but it looked something like this. And then Daniel interpreted the dream. The head of gold represented the Babylonian Empire, but Nebuchadnezzar's empire wasn't going to remain forever. It was going to be conquered. It was eventually going to be replaced by another empire. And eventually that empire would also fall, and another empire would take its place. Then that empire was going to fall, and another would take its place. The fourth and final kingdom would eventually fall away. But it would be revived in the last days, and it would be made up of a 10-nation confederacy. The Antichrist is going to be the head of this 10-nation confederacy. But we're not to be dismayed, because during the reign of those 10 kings, Christ is going to return. And he is going to set up his kingdom upon this earth, and his kingdom is going to last forever. Now, this kingdom is going to be set up physically upon the earth for a period of 1,000 years. That's why it's referred to as the millennium. And then after that, there's going to be a judgment. We're going to see that. There's going to be a great judgment on the earth. And so the heaven and the earth is going to pass away. There's going to be a new heaven, new earth. But Christ's kingdom is going to be established and will last forever. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse number 44. During the reign of those kings, what kings is he referring to? The 10 toes. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness and will stand forever. That's the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But Daniel didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar or us who the second empire would be, or the third, or the fourth. How do we know that this is, we know it's the Babylonian Empire because he told us that, but he didn't tell us what the next empire would be. How do we know it's the Medo-Persian Empire? How did we know that the next one would be the Grecian Empire? How did we know that the next one would be the Roman Empire? Because he didn't tell us. Oh, yes, he did. If you keep reading the book of Daniel, you find out who the other empires are and in what order they came. Because Daniel had other visions. And in those visions, God is going to fill in the blanks. It's one of those things that you come upon it and you say, oh, okay, he's given us this much information, but now there's a lot of questions. Well, you just have to keep reading because he's going to answer those questions. And in the vision of the ram and the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, we find out who the next two kingdoms are. So tonight, we're going to be studying that vision, the vision of the ram and the he-goat. So turn to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to look at the first 2 verses. It says, during the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, saw another vision. Now, we're going to have to work backwards next week, but I'm doing this in a specific order. You're going to find out why next week. He also had a vision of the 4 wild beasts. And we're going to look at that next week. But I want you to understand when he says, I, Daniel, saw another vision, he's not referring to Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the vision he had of that dream. He's referring to the vision of the 4 wild beasts. And he said, I saw another vision following the one that had already appeared to me. In this vision, I was at the fortress of Susa, in the province of Elam, standing beside the Ulai River. Now, let's put this in some kind of time frame, if you don't mind. Because many times we just kind of lump that all together and say, oh, that's Old Testament. But you need to understand the timeline here. Nebuchadnezzar's dream occurred sometime around 603 BC, in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. At that time, Daniel would have been a very, very young man. Scholars estimate that Daniel was about 23 years old at that time. Can you imagine being 23 years old and you save all of the wise men? Because you have such a relationship with God that when you start praying, God gives you a vision of a man's dream and then gives you the interpretation. But that's how old Daniel was. That's why the New Testament tells us not to despise our youth. We're not to look at our youth if we're young, and I'm not there anymore. But when I was young, we were not supposed to despise our youth because God doesn't look upon age in the way we do. If someone has a heart for God, He's going to bless them. He's going to anoint them. And that's what happened to Daniel. Now, the vision of the ram and the he-goat occurred around 538 BC, the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. That's about 65 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Daniel was about 88 years old when he had this vision. He was an old man. In fact, what's kind of interesting, after this vision, he literally gets sick. He's exhausted. His body is not to the point where he can stay out all night and get up early in the morning and still go to work. So after he has this vision, and we won't see that, so I'm kind of giving you a little preview when you go back and read this. After the vision, he's done all of this, he's totally exhausted, and then it says he was sick for several days. Why? Because he's an old man at this time. Now, notice that in the vision, Daniel was at the fortress of Susa, standing beside the Ulai River. In other words, in the vision, Daniel was translated to the future capital of Persia, which is Susa. The word translated means to transfer from one place to another. That's no problem for God. We see it in the New Testament. We see one of the people in the New Testament, he's ministering, and all of a sudden he's translated somewhere else. God can do that. We see when Jesus was resurrected, he was translated from one place to another. Well, in this vision, I don't believe that Daniel was physically translated, but in the vision, he was translated to the future capital of Persia. Now, in the vision, when he was translated to Susa, that's in modern-day Iran. Susa's about 225 miles due east of Babylon, and as I have already mentioned, it was going to be the future capital of Persia. So he's literally going to see this take place, but he's at the place where the next kingdom's going to come from. Now, in the vision, Daniel saw a ram with two horns next to the river. One horn was higher than the other. Now, remember what horns represent. Does everyone remember what horns represent? Kings. Yes, strength and power, but when it's in these visions, horns represent kings. One horn was higher than the other, and the ram pushed westward, northward, and southward, and no beast could stand before it. So the ram with two horns became very great. The two kings became very great. And as Daniel was considering the ram with two horns, a he-goat came from the west, and his feet didn't touch the ground. Now, what does he mean his feet didn't touch the ground? Well, that's a figure of speech that means he moved very, very fast. He ran so fast that you couldn't see his feet touching the ground. Anyone ever said that? Man, he was running so fast, his feet weren't even touching the ground. No, his feet were touching the ground. It just didn't seem like they were. And this goat had one large horn between his eyes. And he charged the ram with two horns, and he hit the ram, and he broke the ram's two horns. And he knocked the ram to the ground, and he stamped on the ram until he killed it. And the he-goat became very great. And when the goat was at the peak of his strength, the great horn was broken. Now, what does a horn represent? A king. And up came four horns. And the four horns went toward the four winds of the heaven. In other words, one horn went towards the north, one king did. One horn went to the south, another to the east, and another to the west. And out of one of the horns came this little horn. And the little horn became very great. And it went towards the south. Now, whenever in the Old Testament you see towards the south, it usually refers to Egypt. All right? Egypt is really the only nation around that area that they ever went to conquer. They didn't go any further into Africa. They just usually went to Egypt. And then it says it went towards the east. In other words, towards modern-day Iraq and Iran, where the Medo-Persian Empire was and where the Babylonian Empire had been. And it says towards the pleasant land. Now, what is the pleasant land? Anyone ever heard that phrase? The pleasant land is Israel. And it says it grew so strong that it attacked the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the stars and it trampled upon them. Now, we usually don't understand this because we're not familiar with symbols. We're not familiar with Hebrewisms and figures of speech. But if you're familiar with those Hebrewisms, it's not a problem. So let me just kind of explain a few things. The phrase host of heaven is a figure of speech that refers to the residents of heaven. In other words, God's people. Stars in the Old Testament symbolized either angels or who? Jews. Why? Well, if you remember, God told Abraham that his descendants were going to be as numerous as what? The stars in the sky. So in the Old Testament, whenever you saw stars, if it didn't refer to them literally, it usually either referred to angels, because they're like the stars in the sky too, they're numerous, or it referred to the Jews. And the little horn exalted itself to the point that it challenged God by taking away the daily sacrifices in the temple. Now, that was the vision that Daniel had of the ram and the he-goat. You'll find that in chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. I decided to tell you about the vision rather than read it. It seems like when I read a lot of Scripture, people kind of zone out. Do you do that? So I thought if I would tell it instead of read it, then you would maybe hang with me. But if you want to go back and read it, you can read it for yourself in chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. Now let's look at the interpretation. And as we look at the interpretation, we're going to go through the scripture verse by verse. All right? Let's read verses 16 through 26 so you get an overview of it, and then we're going to break it down. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Uli, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Who do you think Gabriel is? Yeah, the archangel. Whenever a message needs to be sent, who do they send? Good old Gabriel. So he came near to where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. What we're studying the end times. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. What do you think that means? Ever heard the term slain in the spirit? Probably slain in the spirit. Scared to death. Okay, just like the Romans, when the angel came, rolled away the stone, Jesus was resurrected, they fell down like dead men, all right? This is Daniel. But he touched me and he made me stand upright. He made him. He forced him, is what the Hebrew says. And he said, Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. For it pertains to the appointed time of the what? The end. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eye is the first king. And the broken horn and the four horns that rose in his place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation. Whose nation? The first king's nation, although not with his power. In other words, they're not going to be as strong. That's why it's divided between four. And in the latter period of their rule, whose rule? The four kings. All right? When the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise. Now, this is very important. We're going to see this in just a little bit. Insolent and skilled in intrigue, and his power will be not mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart. And he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes. Wow. Who's the prince of princes? Oh, yeah. But he will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which have been told is true. But keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Now, let's go through this passage of Scripture and let's see how it applies to Nebuchadnezzar's dream and to the end times. Because when we're going through the book of Revelation, there's many times we're going to refer back to the book of Daniel. And if you don't understand the book of Daniel, it's going to seem like, that's just a mess in Revelation. But it's not. And I'm going to make this so simple that anyone can understand it. You might have to go home, look at the notes again. You might even have to get on the internet, listen to the sermon again. But you can understand this. All right? First of all, notice in verse 16 that it's Gabriel, the archangel, that's explaining the vision. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Uli, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. You know what I like about God? He doesn't want to keep us shrouded in mystery. He doesn't want us to go around in ignorance. God wants us to know. That's why our ministry is more of a teaching ministry. The reason we're going to be teaching on marriage is because God doesn't want you to have a bad marriage. He wants you to have a good marriage. But let me tell you, the key to a good marriage is knowledge. Jesus said you shall know the truth, and the truth shall do what? Set you free. But if you don't know the truth, you're going to always be in bondage. Now, it's up to you whether you apply the truth, but God doesn't want you to be shrouded in mystery or in the ignorance. And so he tells Gabriel, tell this man, give this man some understanding. Now, let's look at the interpretation that Gabriel gave to Daniel. The ram with two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Look at verse number 20. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the king of Media and Persia. Now, in Daniel's vision, the ram pushed northward, westward, and southward, and nothing could stand in its way. In other words, it became the ruling empire of the known world. This empire corresponds to the silver chest and the arms of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So when I told you last week, just to fill this in, can we go back to the statue? I told you to write across here, Medo-Persian Empire. How do we know that's the Medo-Persian Empire? Because in the future vision of the ram and the he-goat, he tells us. All right? The right arm represents the Persians because they were the stronger of the two. That's also why one horn of the ram was higher than the other. Their empire was represented by silver because their empire wasn't as wealthy as the Babylonian Empire. Why? What do you think that is? I told you last week. Do you remember? It's because you don't have one king. Now you have two kingdoms that's in an alliance. So now the wealth of the empire has to be spread between two. So it's no longer gold, it's silver. Now what's interesting is that the emblem of Persia at the time was a ram. Its coins had a ram's head on one side, and it had a ram that was resting on the other side. Not only that, but the Persian king would ride before his army wearing a golden ram's head as a crown. How many of you have ever seen pictures of Persia and you would see the king coming out and what would be on his head? A ram's head. It was golden. He didn't have a crown like others. Why? Because the ram represented the Persians. Very interesting. The he-goat with the one great horn between its eyes represents Greece. How do we know that? Look at verse 21. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who was the first king of the Grecian Empire? Alexander the Great. And Daniel's vision, it didn't touch the ground, or its feet didn't touch the ground. In other words, Alexander the Great's army moved so quickly you couldn't see it moving. It was there before you knew it. You see, no army before Alexander the Great could mobilize and move so quickly. They were very slow. Before Alexander the Great, when one army or one nation moved against another nation, you had plenty of time to prepare for battle because the armies moved slowly. It took a lot of time to move these armies, but not Alexander the Great's army. He moved his army and he attacked before anyone could prepare. In fact, when messengers would be sent, they would say, Alexander the Great, or they didn't call him that, but they would say, Greece is coming. And they would say, okay, we need to prepare. And before you knew it, they were already there. They were right behind the messengers. That's why his smaller army defeated greater armies. According to Clarence Larkin, with an army of 30,000 men and 5,000 cavalrymen, he defeated the Persian army of 600,000 men commanded by Darius. Now, around here you hear it Darius, but that's because we're from Cherokee County, but it's really Darius, all right? He fought the Persians one more time at the Tigris River, and he annihilated them, although they had almost 10 times as many men. How could he do that? Well, first of all, he was very strategic. Even though he was very, very young, he understood warfare. And when he was a child, he had been tutored by the best. In fact, you can go back and look at the great Greek philosopher that actually tutored him. But what's interesting about him is he knew how to take the landscape. And he would actually get to the battlefield before anyone else. And he would actually set up the battle the way he wanted to go. And he'd pull them in, and then he would be able to take control of it. And his smaller army would literally annihilate the enemy. But Alexander didn't reign long. He became king in 336 BC at the age of 20, and he died in 323 BC at the age of 33. It's kind of sad, isn't it? Here's Alexander the Great, and he's dead by the age of 33. His empire was the third world empire in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and it's represented by the bronze belly, And I told you the thighs and the gluteus maximus. So right here it says brass, but actually bronze. That's who? That's Greece. We know that because of this vision. Now, I'd like to go into greater detail at this time, if you don't mind. And I think it's going to be interesting to you. It's one of those little things that, it's not really going to affect what we believe when it comes to the end times, but it's really an interesting little fact that God puts in there. So let's go into a little more detail. Notice in verse number 6 that the he-goat charged the ram in a great rage. Notice what it says. He came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and he charged him in a great rage. In fact, in the very next verse, it talks about furiously battling him. Do you realize that Alexander the Great's war with Persia was personal? He had a vendetta. He wasn't just going to defeat Persia, he was going to annihilate them. You see, in 480 BC, Persia invaded Greece. At the pass of Thermopylae, a small force that was led by the king of Sparta held off the Persians for 3 days. The Spartans were eventually betrayed by one of their own who showed the Persians a path that led behind the Greek lines. In fact, the movie The 300 is actually based upon that. They've taken a lot of liberties, but how many have seen The 300? They came in there and literally held them off at this pass until they went behind them. They wouldn't have been able to hold them off forever, but they did for a while. But it was the Battle of Thermopylae that supposedly caused Alexander the Great to hate the Persians. And it's why he attacked them with a great rage. It was personal to him. He didn't just want to defeat them. He wanted to annihilate them and to destroy their kingdoms. Now, after Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided among 4 of his generals. Cassander, who took Macedonia in the western part of Alexander the Great's empire. Lysimachus, who took Thrace in the northern part of the empire. And Seleucus, who took Syria in the eastern part. And Ptolemy, who took Egypt in the southern part. Now, this is exactly what Daniel saw in his vision. This is why liberals read the book of Daniel and they go, Daniel could not have been written when they say it was, because no one could have predicted this as accurately as he did. But Daniel did, because God knows the future. Look at Daniel 8:8. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, his large horn was broken off. Now, a horn represents a king, right? Who was the first king? Alexander the Great. So at the height of his power, at the peak of his strength, 33 years old, Alexander the Great dies. Now there's a lot of theories of what he died of. Some even think he was poisoned. Others said, he got drunk, and as a result of this, he laid out in the rain and he was sick. He caught malaria. Doesn't matter. At 33 years of age, at the height of his power, the horn was broken off. He died. And in its place, 4 prominent horns. What are horns? Kings. 4 prominent kings grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And guess what? They divided the kingdom just like Daniel said they would. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Out of one of the 4 horns, a little horn came up and it grew very large. Now, it says a little horn. What's a horn? A king. A little king's going to come up out of one of the 4 horns. And it grew towards the south, the east, and the glorious land. The glorious land, again, I told you, is just another name for Israel. Look at verse number 9. Out of one of them, that's referring to, what is them? Those 4 horns. Out of one of the 4 horns came another horn, which started small, but it grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. The little horn was Antiochus Epiphanes. Anyone ever heard of Antiochus Epiphanes? Antiochus began strengthening his kingdom by pushing to the east and to the south, just like Daniel predicted. He invaded Egypt, and he overran it except for Alexandria. Now, while he was marching with his army to Alexandria, they had already taken the small island of Cyprus, a messenger of Rome was sent. And you need to understand, Rome was not the Roman Empire yet. It was coming up. We're going to find out a little bit later after this. It does defeat them, and it becomes the fourth and the last great empire in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But at this point, it's still coming up in its power, but it's strong enough to make threats. So what happened is his army was marching towards Alexandria. A messenger of Rome met him and told him that he must immediately withdraw from Egypt and Cyprus. And Antiochus told him he would discuss it with his council. So guess what the messenger did? The messenger took out a sword and he drew a circle around Antiochus, and he said this: before you cross the circle, I want you to give an answer to the Senate of Rome. What he was implying was that if he stepped out of the circle without agreeing to what Rome said, Rome would immediately declare war upon him. So he withdrew in humiliation. This spread. Everyone heard about it, and he was humiliated. But he also knew he couldn't stand up against Rome, and everything that he had worked for, everything that he had conquered, would be gone if he went against Rome. So he withdrew in humiliation. Now, guess whose land he had to cross when he was going home, and who he would take his wrath out on as he was going home? You got it. Israel. In his fury, he did the following when he came to Israel. He plundered Jerusalem. He outlawed the Jewish religion and replaced it with Greek worship. He outlawed the observance of the Sabbath. He outlawed circumcision. He outlawed the reading of the Scriptures. He burned whatever Scriptures he found. He sacrificed a pig on the altar at the temple. He set up an idol in the temple. He compelled idol worship around all the other cities around Jerusalem. He claimed he was God manifested in the flesh, and he demanded to be worshiped as God. In a sense, he attacked God. And Daniel saw all of this in his vision. This is why, again, liberals read this and they go, there is no way. Notice what Daniel saw in verses 9 through 12 and the interpretation. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the beautiful land. And it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth. Now, it grew up to the host of heaven. Didn't mean it grew up this way. The host of heaven represents who? Residents of heaven, which are God's people. So it grew up to God's people. It grew all the way to Israel. And in the beginning, he was peaceful with Israel. He passed through Israel's land to go to Egypt. He had a peace treaty with Israel. He wasn't going to touch them. Does that make sense? And he caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and he trampled them down. So what did he do? He grabbed some of the stars. He compelled them to worship. They actually fell. But then he killed and slaughtered and murdered so many. He even magnified himself to be equal with the commander of the host. Who is the commander of the children of God? Jesus. But at this point, it's the Old Testament. So it's the Lord of hosts is what he would be referred to. And so he magnified himself to be equal to God. And he removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. And it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Now this is very, very important. It's a very important vision because Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. In other words, what Antiochus Epiphanes did is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do during the tribulation, because Antiochus is a type of the Antichrist. Does that make sense? Now, let me prove that to you. It's easy for me to say that, but I can prove it to you in the Scriptures. Notice in verse 16 and 17 that Gabriel tells Daniel that the vision has to do with the end times. Look at verse 16, 17. And I heard the voice of man between the banks of Uli, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. So Gabriel came near to where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. In other words, what? The end times. So the vision of the ram, the he-goat, has to do with when? The end times. Now, if that's the case, you would naturally expect the fourth and the last empire to be mentioned in this vision. Right? Look at the slide. This is Babylon. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. This is Greece. Was Rome even mentioned in this vision? No. Now Gabriel comes on the scene and he says, this vision has to do with the end times. Well, let's be honest. Even Rome doesn't have anything to do with the end times. The revived Roman Empire does. We're going to find out next week that there's actually a gap here. What do you think that gap is? The church age. We studied the church age. We have come to the end of the church age, and any time the rapture can occur. When that rapture occurs, guess what? The revived Roman Empire will be there. The 10 kings are going to be in there. And during the reign of the 10 kings, it says, that's when Christ will return. So what's interesting is this empire is what's going to be at the end times. But these two empires aren't even mentioned in that. So you would think if this vision has to do with the end times, like Gabriel said, Rome would be mentioned, right? But it's not. Why? Why is it not mentioned? Because the little horn that rises out of the four horns of the third empire is not the Antichrist. The little horn is the type of the Antichrist. You see, Moses was a type of who? Jesus. Moses went down to Egypt and his people were in bondage. He led the people of Israel out of bondage, supposedly to the promised land, but there was a gap of time before they went to the promised land. Remember that? And it also says when they came through I always want to say Red River. It's a problem of living in Oklahoma. The Red Sea, they were baptized into Moses, what it says. So Moses was a type of Jesus Christ. And we can look back and see what Moses did, and we can go and look and see what Jesus did, and we can realize Moses was a type of Jesus. But just as Moses was a type of Jesus, guess what? Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. And so just as Jesus could go through the scriptures and prove he was the Messiah when they were on the road to Emmaus and go back and prove all of that, guess what? We can look at Antiochus Epiphanes and we can see, because in the book of Revelation, another little horn is going to rise up. But it's not going to rise up out of the four kings or the four horns. It's going to rise up, according to John, out of the 10 horns that's on the beast. Why is it a little horn and how does it become very great? Well, now we go back to Antiochus. So that tells us that what Antiochus Epiphanes did to Israel is the same thing that the Antichrist is going to do to Israel during the tribulation. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes had a peace treaty with Israel to go through them when they went to attack Egypt, and then he broke it. So the Antichrist, Daniel tells us, and we see that in Daniel chapter 9, is going to create this peace treaty. He's going to allow them to rebuild the temple. And guess what he's going to do? He's going to go into the temple after 3.5 years, and he's going to say, I am God, worship me. And that's the abomination of desolation. But that's the second abomination of desolation. The first abomination of desolation happened when Antiochus Epiphanes, came back and broke the peace treaty, went into the temple, slew the pig, and then said, I am God, worship me. So why does he say this is the end times? Because he's saying this is a picture of what's going to happen. But it's not going to happen until the end time. But you can see all of the things that the Antichrist is going to do. So let's do a quick little recap so you understand what I'm saying. The ram with two horns represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The he-goat represents the Grecian Empire. It attacked and killed the Medo-Persian Empire. The first king of the Grecian Empire was Alexander the Great. When he died, the kingdom was divided among four generals. The vision predicted that out of one of the four horns, a little horn would come. The little horn would grow very strong and, after a peace treaty, would wage war on God's children. And he would end the sacrifices at the temple, declaring himself to be God and demanding to be worshipped. That man fulfilled it was Antiochus Epiphanes. He is a type of the Antichrist. That's why this vision is so important, because the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do as we read through the book of Revelation. That's why scholars apply these scriptures to the Antichrist. So many times you'll be reading through this, Daniel chapter 8, and you'll go, well, wait a minute. They're saying that the Antichrist is going to do that. How can scholars do that? Scholars do that because they recognize that Antiochus Epiphanes is simply a type of what the Antichrist is going to be. Now, next week, we're going to look at one more vision, and then we're going to go back to Revelation. That vision is the vision of the four wild beasts. When we finish that vision, we're going to go back to the second seal. Now, when we get to the second seal, we're going to have to go into Ezekiel chapter 37, 38, and 39. But I promise you, once we finish Ezekiel, we're going to stay in the book of Revelation, except for every once in a while referring back. But Revelation is going to make so much more sense because you understand Daniel.
Antiochus Epiphanes occupies a significant place in both world history and the Bible, serving as a precursor to the anticipated arrival of a figure known as the Antichrist. Emerging around 175 BC, Antiochus initially portrayed himself as a man of peace, captivating the public with his eloquence and flattery. His cunning approach led the people to accept him not only as the rightful king of Syria but also of Israel, as prophesied in Daniel 11 verse 21 to 22. In the Old Testament, the Prince of the Covenant refers to the high priest in Jerusalem, while in the New Testament, the Prince of the Covenant is Jesus. Ananias was the legitimate high priest, a Jewish high priest. Antiochus Epiphanes brutally threw him out and exalted an apostate, a false priest, a man called Menelaus. The Jews started being suspicious. He took over the fat lands of Israel, Edom, Moab, all Palestine up to Syria as prophesied. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil, and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Daniel 11 verse 24. He came down to invade Egypt with a great army, and the old rivalry between Egypt and Syria was renewed, as was said. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Daniel 11 verse 25. Antiochus Epiphanes tricked some leaders of the south to turn against their king, and Ptolemy was betrayed as prophesied. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow. And many shall fall down slain. Daniel 11 verse 26. Antiochus then came down to Egypt to sign a peace treaty. The two leaders, Antiochus and Ptolemy, lied in the signing of the treaty as prophesied. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Daniel 11, verse 27. Antiochus secretly devised the destruction of the Old Covenant, intending to replace it with pagan Hellenistic, hedonistic culture and religion as prophesied. His heart shall be against the covenant. Daniel 11, verse 28. Feeling that he has the situation well with the Egyptians after signing the treaty, he decided to conquer Egypt once again, but the ships of Chittim, which is Cyprus, came down against him as prophesied. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Daniel 11, verse 30. Ships of Chittim were Roman Empire soldiers stationed in Cyprus. The Roman soldiers stopped Antiochus from attacking Egypt, and in his anger and frustrations, he turned back to Jerusalem to avenge his anger on the Jews as prophesied. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenants. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. On arriving in Jerusalem, that night many Jews were slaughtered. He went into the temple, took away the daily sacrifice, set up an image, and demanded every person to worship it. He slaughtered a pig inside the temple, and the priests were forced to drink the pig blood. This is the abomination that makes the temple desolate. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. Daniel 11, verse 31. Antiochus sent Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers to pollute Jerusalem and the temple. Thus it is said, arms shall stand on his part. Daniel 11, verse 32. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The Jews became devastated by this massacre and abomination. One Jewish priest, Maccabean, refused to blaspheme God, and Antiochus Epiphanes killed him. The 5 sons of Maccabean, led by Judas Maccabean, began to merge a guerrilla war on the Antiochus and his armies. Reason it is said, but the people that do know their God shall be strong. Daniel 11, verse 32. Miraculous other Jews started joining the Maccabean family, and the Maccabean revolt took place. Antiochus Epiphanes and his armies were drawn out of Jerusalem. When Judas Maccabean and his brothers come into the temple, they found oil to last the candles lit for one day. It took 8 days to make and sanctify the oil. They prayed, and miraculously the oil lasted 8 days. Reason the Jews celebrate Hanukkah on 25th December for 8 days. The Jews do not celebrate Christmas as other people of the world do, but they celebrate Hanukkah. Then the gap of Daniel's 70 weeks comes in at this point. The gap, as you have seen in the 70 weeks of Daniel, is the church age. Angel Gabriel then goes on to define Antichrist character in his 1 week 7 years. Reign from Daniel 11 verse 36 onwards.
Here Jesus, ek weet ek is 'n sondaar. Ek besef dat ek nie sal hemel toe gaan as ek nie 'n verhouding met U het nie. Ek glo dat U aarde toe gekom het en vir my gesterf het aan die kruis en weer opgestaan het uit die dood. Was my sonde weg deur U bloed en maak van my 'n nuwe mens. Ek wil nie meer sondig nie. Help my om vir U te lewe. Ek gee vandag my hart vir U en kroon U as koning van my lewe. Dankie dat ek nou deel is van die hemelse familie. Amen.